Explained by the Billy Meier contacts. Mysteries, myths, legends, conspiracy theories, historical inaccuracies, and more. Compiled by David Chance, revised October 18, 2023.
Alexander the Great Death of Alexander the Great. Contact Report 372.
It has been said since time immemorial that King Alexander III of Macedonia, that is to say, Alexander the Great, was murdered by poison in Babylon. However, Quetzal explained to me in 1984 that this wouldn't correspond to the truth. He told me that at the age of almost 33, the king had fallen ill with the West Nile virus during his war campaigns in Babylonia, namely in Babylon in the year 323 BC. Whereby he had been treated by his doctors with all kinds of healing juices and beverages. One of the juices would have been a brew of white hellebore, and this brew would have finally led to the death. If I remember Quetzal's words correctly, the brew was used to irritate Alexander's throat several times a day with a buzzard feather soaked in it to induce a vomiting. The opinion of the doctors at that time, always according to Quetzal, was that it was assumed that vomiting would be extremely beneficial against fever, headaches, nausea, and cramps, as well as all kinds of other terrible things. This procedure with white hellebore would then have caused the death of Alexander the Great after 12 days or so, which, however, had not been intended by the doctors. White hellebore, or simply false helleborine, as the plant is called, grows in many countries and is highly toxic. And to my knowledge, the poison also finds use in homeopathy, especially for diarrhea with vomiting, dysentery, as well as for collapsed states and circulatory weaknesses. For my part, I know the plant from the Alps and the Pyrenees as well as from the Jura, where the white hellebore belongs to the typical flora, of which basically everything is very poisonous, so the rootstock and the roots, as well as the whole stem, leaf, and flower structure. And what else has to be said about Alexander the Great? He was a murderer without thinking, who himself murdered his best friends at will, and was immensely addicted to conquering, which is why he also created a gigantic empire through campaigns of conquest, which spanned from Macedonia to Egypt and as far as Persia and India, and that within only a few years, from 336 to 323 BC, during which he was king. Everywhere he designated the capital cities after his name, namely Alexandria or Alexandropolis. If I remember the history lessons correctly, he was born in Pella, Macedonia, Greece, in 356 BC. His father was King Philip II of Macedonia, who was treacherously murdered, which Alexander was able to witness secretly, which subsequently shaped him into a multiple murderer himself, but which did not prevent him from being a scholar of Aristotle. But now the question, why should Alexander the Great have died unintentionally due to the brew white hellebore, if the brew was actually used as a medicine? Do you know anything about that?
White hellebore, that is to say false helleborine, belongs to the family Liliaceae, and thus to the lily family. The plant goes by the Latin name Veratrum album, Linn, and is indeed very poisonous. In prehistoric Greece, white hellebore, that is to say Veratrum album, was the most important medicinal plant altogether. It was regarded as the central medicine of the herbalists, the root diggers for whom the plant was regarded as carrier of magical powers. Hence, they approached the plant only using shamanic rituals. White hellebore was considered a holy plant of the gods. The most important application of the root was its use as snuff. In other words, it found a nasal use to trigger artificial sneezing, which was intended to make disease ghosts and demons leave the diseased body. The poisonous active substances of the plant are steroid alkaloids and steroid-like alkaloids, with 3 ester alkaloids to be mentioned as the main active substances, namely germarin and protoveratrine A and B. But to answer your question now, Alexander the Great was indeed not murdered but died due to a so-called medical professional error. The king was indeed infected by the West Nile virus, lay seriously ill down, and was treated by his personal physicians with all kinds of ointments, decoctions, and brews. And in fact, it happened. The way Quetzal explained to you that Alexander the Great was being treated daily with a white hellebore brew. Just as you said, a bird of prey feather was dipped 2 to 3 times a day with the tip into the brew to then be inserted into the king's mouth. Thereby the palate was tickled until a vomiting occurred. This procedure was repeated daily for about 12 days, causing Alexander the Great to be unintentionally poisoned in small amounts without receiving a lethal dose all at once. In this manner, the poison was slowly accumulated in his body, and namely until the dosage was that large that the man died. Still to explain is that with an intake of 1 to 2 grams of dried powder white hellebore, and with higher fever, the entire arrangement brings forth a deadly effect. In smaller quantities, white hellebore can very well serve as an effective medication.
It's scary to die like this. When I think of how the man must have suffered, regardless of whether he was a multiple murderer or not.
It is not to be wished to anyone.